Hi, everyone. I'm Karwai, and I'm here with my colleagues, Megan and Simon, and we're interaction designers at the Home Office. And we're going to talk to you about these posters we've developed for accessibility. Just a show of hands, how many people have heard of them or come across? Oh, wow, okay. So just to summarize, they're a series of 6 posters that each promote good design guidance for different users in our community. So users on the autistic spectrum, users of screen readers, those with low vision, dyslexics, users of physical and motor disabilities, and users who are deaf and hard of hearing. So the first part of my talk will be about how they came to be created and what we've learned by sharing them with the community and by keeping them open. And the second part of the talk, I'm going to step aside and let Megan and Simon talk about how they've taken those learnings to scale the posters up by building them in code. So I've worked with our Access Needs team in creating these posters, and our Access Needs team is a small team of researchers and designers at the Home Office. The main objective of our goal is to promote accessibility awareness across the department and also across other government departments as well. So we do things like conduct talks and provide access needs trainings. One of the approaches we take in promoting accessibility is to each take on a specific condition, so one of 6 broad conditions, so it could be visual or hearing impairment, learn as much of it as we can so that we could feed back into our team what we've learned and share our findings so that we can gain a greater understanding as a whole. And my focus is on autism, and one of the first things I've learned about it was that people can perceive the world differently, and that includes language. So, for example, whereas some of us may take in language without thinking about it or giving it much thought, others will pay a lot of attention to the construct of language. So what the structural details of the language and the syntax, which makes things like figures of speech harder to understand and thus be taken literally. So I started to think about examples of expressions, figures of speech that can be taken literally and what that can look like. And the first thing that came to mind was this. So this is a picture of cats and dogs falling out of the sky onto an umbrella. So it's a figure of speech it's raining cats and dogs, which implies heavy rain. So this visual gave me an idea to create my first piece of guidance for a poster on designing for users on the autistic spectrum, which is don't use figures of speech. Use plain English instead, because it's simpler and easier to understand. And then I started to look at other design principles that could help users on the spectrum. So things like using simple colors and avoiding bright or highly contrasting colors, because some people may have a sensitivity to things like bright colors and sounds. Using simple sentences and bullets, and don't build complex cluttered layouts, because it can be quite overwhelming and cause anxiety. It's also it's a cognitive overload as well. And make buttons descriptive, so make them clear, manage users' expectations of what will come next when they click on a button, as opposed to making them quite vague, such as click here. And just so everyone knows, these design principles apply to everyone, not just users on the spectrum. The aim of these posters is to highlight certain design principles that may impact certain users more so than others. And in so doing, we raise their profiles and gain more awareness and understanding of different users in our community, of who we're designing for, and when we say we're designing accessibly. This is also one of our core government design principles, where we need to be mindful that we're designing and we're building services for everyone, not just for our own immediate needs. So I'm going to go through some of the posters in the series. The autism poster became a catalyst for rolling out a series of other posters, which I've gathered input and collaboration from the rest of our access needs teams. So this was our second poster, which is designing for users of screen readers. So we need to make sure that you structure content using HTML5, so make sure it's correctly marked up. And don't make something big and bold and pass it off as a header, because screen readers won't be able to read it properly. Don't use color alone to convey meaning, because some users may not be able to distinguish colors easily. So use a combination of colors, shapes, and text. So the more visual cues you can provide, the better. Don't use large blocks of heavy text, because for someone with dyslexia, a lot of words on a page can appear out of focus and can cause blurred vision or headaches. And for someone who isn't dyslexic, large blocks of text can be quite frustrating to read. So break it up with images and diagrams to support it. So make it scannable, because we're already bombarded by so much information anyway. Not everyone uses a mouse, so design for keyboard or speech-only use. So make all functionality available from, say, a keyboard. And if you do happen to use a mouse, don't make dynamic content that requires a lot of mouse movement, because it's the small, finicky, precise movements that can pose a challenge for everyone, especially those with motor difficulties. So provide large hit areas instead. Don't put content in audio or video only. As an additional way of communicating information, provide subtitles and transcripts for videos. So this isn't just for deaf users, it's for anyone that may not be able to hear due to circumstantial situations, such as being in a noisy environment. And then a lot of this guidance also falls under WCAG's 4 principles of accessibility, the POUR principles, which I will go through now. So it's designing a service in such a way that it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So with the guideline for making it perceivable, make sure the service is designed in such a way that users can use different senses, including sight, sound, and touch. So like I've mentioned earlier, providing a lot of visual cues rather than just basing something on color alone, using additional layers of communication such as subtitles and transcripts in addition to audio and video, and making large clickable actions, large hit areas. When you design a service, make sure it's also operable, so making sure it's designed so that all users can use them. So keeping in mind to not just create something for relying on a mouse as the only input mechanism, being able to use designing for keyboard or speech only. Don't have short timeout windows, so make sure you provide enough time for users to read and use the content, and design with different devices in mind, so design with mobile and touchscreen. And also, make it understandable. So make sure the service is designed so that all users can understand it. Is the content short and clear and simple? Is it legible? Are you using plain language as opposed to using flowery expressions or figures of speech? And also, are the call to actions clear? So are you making it predictable as opposed to vague? And last is making it robust. So making sure the service is designed so that it's future-proofed to work with whatever browsers people are using, or whether people are using different versions of screen readers. So making sure you structure the content in HTML properly, making sure things are appropriately tagged. So, sorry about that. So we shared these posters through the GDS accessibility blog and our own home office blog, and through Twitter and GitHub. And we've had a really great response and some really good feedback. Such as this one piece of feedback about adding additional posters to the series. So this came from someone who had suggested that we help accommodate users with various forms of color blindness, and he's provided a lot of great guidance for that as well. We do have quite a lot of things to think about. So things like the colorblind poster. Also, we were thinking about one for mental health as well. So these are ideas we're still playing with. We've also received feedback about including more design advice within existing posters, so such as this one from someone on the spectrum who said to give users a chance to choose to play the audio or video that's present on a page as opposed to it automatically playing, because for her, there's nothing more distressing than clicking on an unsuspecting link and then being confronted with a page with loud sounds and a video playing from out of nowhere. And this caused quite a lot of anxiety for her. This is also a problem for users of screen readers because of the overlapping of sounds. And for someone with motor difficulties, it can be especially challenging if the video is embedded on a very long page and you're trying to find the source of that sound to control it. And the controls could be quite small and finicky as well. So we received a lot of great feedback. And one of the important pieces of feedback we also received was is where context is needed. So we've provided very simple guidance, but sometimes the guidance was too simple, which warranted a lot of questions. So this came from our deaf and hard of hearing poster, which is where we say, don't use complicated words. Well, why can't we use complicated words? Are we saying that deaf users can't understand those words? And that's not the case. What we were trying to explain was that there's different methods of communication, and it could be lip reading or signing. And when you think about lip reading, someone saying complicated words, that's quite a challenge. And signing is its own language. It's not a direct translation of English. It has its own syntax, its own sentence structure, and it's just a language of its own. So it's best when you're signing it really helps to keep it simple. An example of a complicated word could be something like misdemeanor, when you can say small crime instead, or litigation, when you can say take legal action. And we talk about accessibility in the posters, but what about making the posters accessible themselves? One of the early things we found was we've exported them as PDFs, and they weren't properly tagged for screen readers. So we've had a lot of work in working with with our colleagues across government to tag them as appropriately as we can. But PDFs still aren't an ideal accessible format. So we started to consider other alternatives, and one of them was building them in HTML, which Simon and Megan will talk about in a bit. We've also had these posters translated as well. So currently in our GitHub repo, we have about 10 different translations in these languages, in German, Spanish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Swedish, Chinese, Russian, and Turkish. And we've learned a few things along the way when it came to offering them up for translations. The first is that we provided the posters in a format that not a lot of people can use. So when I had initially created these, I created them in Sketch, and because that just happened to be the program I had at hand. And not everyone will have a Sketch license, and not everyone, and Sketch is a Mac-based software, not everyone will use a Mac. So this is where we've reached out to the GitHub community to find out what is a good format to use so that people can open the posters up in whatever graphics program they had. And SVGs was one that was highly suggested. Another was to provide a Creative Commons license logo to tell people it's okay to modify these posters and to distribute and share these posters. There were a lot of concerns about copyright issues, so we've included a Creative Commons license to offer that reassurance. And we've also encouraged people to collaborate on the translation. So where there were multiple requests or people reaching out to us to translate it in, like 2 people reaching out and saying they want to translate it in the same language, we've encouraged them to work together and then be able to help each other out when it comes to making compromises if there were differences of opinions on how certain advice could be portrayed. And I just wanted to share this really handy site, this Git browser site that Joe Landman at GDS created as an alternative and more visual way of accessing the posters at GitHub. Is that? Hi Joe. I'll share the links towards the end of the slides. So we received a lot of great feedback as a result of sharing these posters. We've had suggestions to create more posters to add to the series. We've had suggestions to add more design principles within the posters, existing posters, and then we've also had suggestions to provide more context within those design principles. And we also need to consider the formats we've been using because obviously PDFs aren't great, and we've used Sketch as a work file, which isn't quite ideal for lots of our users as well. So I'm just going to step aside and let Megan and Simon talk about what they've done in terms of next steps.
Hi. So when we were given the brief to code up the posters in HTML, we started off by thinking about how the design might need to adapt for the digital format, but also remain accessible itself. So we jumped into Sketch, started with mobile first, and then thought about how the design might expand upwards in resolution, and then thinking about all of the little design details along the way. So, for example, now that you can scroll up and down on a mobile, does the do and don't header need to stay static at the top, or should it persist all the way down the page so you don't lose track of which ones are do and which ones are don't? Do we use card design so that it's more modular and we can add more principles really easily and build new poster pages really easily? Yeah, and thinking about how that translates into the new design. And we also thought about how the user might interact with this site now that it's more interactive. So we thought about how you might navigate from the hub page to all the different access needs pages. And for example, a lot of this advice, although it's separated into different access needs by the posters, is actually great advice in general for design that also happens to be great for accessibility. So we thought about maybe bringing together lots of different general guidance and making that its own page, or surfacing it as soon as the user lands on the site and letting them kind of filter down and drill down into the specific needs that they were designing for at the time. Yeah, and the idea of also, would they want to see, for example, screen readers and low vision guidance at the same time? So these were ideas that we were floating around. And as Karwai mentioned, this is a great opportunity for us to give more context to the principles that were in the posters. So we thought, how could we display that in the most accessible way possible? So we thought about perhaps giving each principle a modal, which is actually relatively difficult to make accessible. So we moved on from that idea quite quickly. Does it go to a different page? But we ended up with a very simple idea of trying to keep the content concise and to the point enough so that we could just surface it without having the user move to a different place. And just insert it into the page in a way that doesn't break the rhythm and keeps the layouts consistent. And once we had a clearer idea of what the design would look like for the first version, we jumped into coding the posters. So our process for this has been to try lots of different frameworks and methods, see which ones work best, which are the most accessible, and then come together and work on a final version. But I'll let Megan talk about that process in more detail.
Thank you. So we were both kind of working on a design at the same time. We kind of work on it a bit and come back together and compare what we sort of come up with. Started in mobile first, sort of with a couple of strays into going big. And kind of we enjoyed the flexibility of how you could add different sized information, different images, and kind of quite quickly got to a stage where we had a kind of responsive mobile and desktop version of these posters. We kind of kept in mind the idea of having the menu page and something that you could navigate through. We really wanted to keep the kind of original quality of the design. It felt like it kind of bookended nicely with it, and so ended up with the do's and don'ts still kind of in the 2 columns, as we've talked about before, and kind of, yeah. It sort of just tried to keep staying true to the poster, like a core kind of principle of the way that we were working design-wise. We went to James Buller, our accessibility lead at the Home Office, to sort of give an accessibility heuristic review of the posters. And just a couple of things that we'd overlooked while we'd been sort of bearing in mind the principles that the poster talked about. There are things that kind of slipped through the net. Just kind of a couple of reminders of the difference between designing and actually using a sort of screen reader meant that a couple of headings had to be kind of uniform. Images that we had alongside the title that were sort of really important to the kind of view of the poster were sort of pointed out as a little bit more decorative. So kind of we made them background images. And also the placement of the do's and don'ts. To use with a screen reader, it meant that sort of jumping back and forward between, you'd sort of hear do at the beginning and then hear the principles. So in the same way that scrolling down, you might lose which sort of section you're in, it also kind of worked that way with the screen reader. So we sort of moved the do's and don'ts into the actual points. Also, we kind of realized that it was actually announcing the alt text of the images before the text, which didn't make that much sense. So we sort of worked that into the design to reverse it. And the alt text itself, I think we've both done accessibility training, and when you're suddenly put in a place where that's the only information you're going on, you sort of change your alt text a bit. And again, the clear links, sometimes we concentrated a bit more on the design, so brought those back into being a bit more functional and easy to use. And then we got to the point where we have a fairly sort of robust. It still needs a lot of work to it's kind of the real accessibility of the actual code. We would absolutely, I would sort of say a bit at the end about how we'd love feedback from anyone now, just through lack of resources of where we are. But I'll give you a little demo of the posters as they sit. So if we switch to that view. Oh, sorry. Oh, right. Yes. Yeah? Should be plugged in. It's worked seamlessly before. Yeah. Yeah. If it doesn't work, I'll leave you with the link and a bit of self-exploration.
Oh, there you go.
Great, amazing. So this is the sort of homepage that we talked about. It has a little bit more context now, which again, we wanted to keep the posters themselves as light as possible, but still I think that sort of Karwai mentioned that these are all for everyone. Like it's not, they're not followed like a kind of Bible, and they're also like use as many of them as you need to in whichever thing you're looking at. And you can click into the posters, and we've incorporated the extra additional content into all of them, and they sort of exist. And the nice thing about this is they're flexible, so additional points that come in can be added in very, very easily. It's in open source code, so yeah, kind of contributions can be requested and very easily as well. And you can sort of navigate through the posters. The screen readers is actually waiting for some additional content. But navigate through the posters kind of easily, as well as using the menu page. So that is where we are at. Please all take a little look. Again, would really, really love feedback. Design, code, general accessibility as well. But yes. Could we switch back? Dare I ask?
Do we have any questions? We've got lots of time for questions. David's got the mic. He will run round.
Just asking about writing the actual copy for the website. Did you have someone specialised in the team to do that, or did you write that yourself?
The copy of we have a content designer who is also part of our Access Needs group, who has helped simplify the content. So we do provide the content, but he would be reviewing it to make sure that it's written in simple, plain terms.
I love the posters, and it's nice to see the web format as well. I've used them in lots of situations. I do a lot of accessibility consultancy, and I think that WCAG is really unusable, and these are the opposite. I think they're really usable, which is amazing. And I guess I wanted to find out more about how the kind of information was put together for each. So how did you find the information for the autism poster? Like, did you do user testing? Do you know what I mean?
So I did do a bit of research in it. We did speak to some organizations as well, and I've also spoken to some users that are on the spectrum to help me provide insight to the posters. The other posters have been fit. So our Access Needs team, we all tend to focus on a specific condition. So after I've created the autism poster, I've gone to the rest of our team, and they fed back the information about other potential good design guidance. And then we had a content designer to review the content so that we could put the posters together. So it's gone through a few iterations as well. But, yeah.
Hello, I just wondered if anything like this has been done before, because I've never heard of an accessible poster, and that's really exciting for me. As a blind person, I've never seen one before. So did you have anything to work with when you first began to make them accessible?
I think our Access Needs team started about 2 years ago, and we were finding ways of promoting accessibility. And as I was a designer, and there was a few other designers in our group as well, I was thinking of ways we can approach learning about accessibility, about other users in our community. I was trying to think, is there a way we can learn it from a design perspective or a design point of view? And given that my focus was on autism, and one of the first things I learned was that figures of speech are hard to interpret, the first thing that really did come to my mind, and it's strange, but it was quite similar to that silhouette. I was thinking of cats and dogs coming out of the sky, and that I thought that was quite an interesting way of interesting visual that could be the basis of a poster. So yeah, that's how it started. Yeah.
Cool. Hi, Avi from NHS Digital. I was just wondering how the posters tested with people with accessibility issues. I think often when you design something, when you put it in front of people, the end result is you get some interesting feedback that you never thought of.
Yeah.
Did you do continuous testing with people and then iterate?
Well, we did get some feedback from the posters when we share them on GitHub. So we've had some users who had said that they were quite, they were quite helpful. And I guess so we had one of the feedback we received was one where where we needed to provide more principles. So that was something that we had considered when it came to scaling them up in code. Yeah, I don't know if I quite answered your question there. I'm sorry.
I think at the last at one of the cross-gov accessibility meetup talks, we presented these at a much earlier stage when we were coding, and got some really good feedbacks from some of people who were with access needs of what to feed in there as well. So specifically, the code was in a very beginning sort of, I don't know, rough state, I guess. And so then we had the feedback from what was actually there of, okay, can you make it so we can change the contrast? And I need to be able to change the text. So that fed into it at that point, into the coding part of it. But a lot of work had gone in first, so yeah.
Oh, I also wanted to say that there was some feedback where some people felt that the principles didn't quite resonate with them. So someone that was on the spectrum had said, well, I tend to prefer bright colors, and because I have a hyposensitivity, or I have an undersensitivity. So it was, the guidance on the posters aren't prescriptive. They do need to be, we're just providing general guidance, but you do need to test with users to get the balance right, because it's not to say one type of guidance will apply to like all the users of, of a certain condition, or so.
Designer at Snook. Sorry, I don't think half of that came out. My question is, what do you think the next steps are to make sure that we can get some of these fantastic insights into the best place for them to be implementable? Is it perhaps a checklist or something like that? Have we push it a bit further?
Sorry, what was the last bit of the question? Sorry.
How can we make these posters, how can we give them the best chance of being implemented? So how can we better help designers out there to actually use some of the insights that you've come up with? Is it perhaps a checklist, or what's the kind of next steps do you see?
We may be adding more posters to the series.
It's kind of, I think, because it's being built into government standards, like accessibility it's sort of in there as the service assessment, and by creating them in the easiest shared format, I guess that's sort of, by having a website, it's easier to pass around. So I think that's sort of the first thing that we're doing, is now like really going for ways to share it. But yeah, it could be, it's hard to get buy-in, I think, to create space for that. So a checklist is sort of a really nice idea. But yeah, I think that thinking about that is the next step.
Hi, I'm John. I work at the BBC. It's interesting how you've split some of the categories, specifically autism and dyslexia, because there's a lot of linkages between those two. And to my mind, it seems as to create a slightly artificial divide between the two.
Yeah.
Because you get some people who will talk, I've completed this list, and not that one. It just seems to create an artificial link, whereas the research is pushing them as a spectrum condition.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not meant to create a divide. I think it's a way of understanding different users in our society. So whereas some of them do tend to cross-reference with other good design guidance for different user groups. It's, yeah, I guess we could still try to work on that bit, but it's I mean, like I said earlier, like a lot of the good design guidance really do apply to everyone, and then some of them from one poster may as well apply to users in a different poster, but it was just trying to capture some of the key guidance and exemplifying or showcasing them for each user group. I mean, we could create a much longer list, and it could encompass almost all of these good design guidance.
To me, part of their power is that they raise awareness of different conditions. I think far too often when people design and build, they don't consider a diverse audience. So I think part of their power has been kind of calling out the different types of people that you need to be considering. But you're absolutely right, there will be huge crossover in some of that advice, but that's almost not the point. The point is not a definitive list of advice, it is raising awareness and kind of getting people to think more about this. I think like we spoke previously, like, because if people do have idea, like this is one way to raise awareness, there are other ways like checklists. We've just We've just built something at GDS that I might share in a second that does a similar thing, and it'd be really good to get kind of insight and feedback from people about what they find an effective way to learn about this stuff and to action it. So yeah, but I think like the fact they've gone so viral kind of shows how effective they've been at kind of raising awareness. Yeah.
So there's another poster that has been widely shared on Twitter, which was originally created by Microsoft, which casts accessibility in broader terms than just what people think. So they categorize a disability under permanent, temporary, or situational. So a person might be hearing impaired, or they might simply be in a noisy bar, or they might have a motor disability, or they might just be a new parent holding a baby.
Yeah.
So this poster has a similar aha effect like the ones that you've created, and I wonder whether you might create a version of it as part of the same family, or otherwise just also share that one.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could. Yeah, we'd be open for suggestions of creating more. It's interesting because some of we've also created a do's and don'ts poster for user research as well, like good practice when it comes to lab testing. So we kind of done something quite similar in that respect. But yeah, no, we'd be open to creating more posters. Yeah.
So hands up if you kind of have printed the posters out and have them in your office at all. So it's about 10 people there. How many people have like kind of shared them with colleagues and have kind of got, that's about 40 people. Cool, okay, awesome. Okay, that is, I think, time for one last question. If anyone's got one last question. Not, Nate? Okay, oh, one last question at the back.
Hello, my name's Lynette. I work for a charity called Demand Design and Manufacture for Disability. You were mentioning about the bright colours and then the duller colours, I guess, low contrast, as conflicting advice from different users.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know if you've had a situation where the advice that you're given is so conflicting that you have to choose one or the other. It's black or white.
Yeah, it's hard to choose. I think it is where you do need to think that these posters are just general guidance, and that you do need to test with users to get that balance right. Because, like I mentioned earlier, that you may have someone on the spectrum who prefers, who may have a hypersensitivity to colors. So bright, high contrast colors may not be preferred. But then someone that's hyposensitive or not as sensitive would prefer something that's quite high contrast, or low vision, or someone who has low vision may prefer high contrast. So, but then I think I've heard discussions where there was someone who had low vision who actually preferred low contrast. But I guess the point is that yeah, these aren't meant to be prescriptive. It's meant to be just general guidance and guidelines to be mindful of when you're designing. But you do need to really think about your users and be able to get that balance right. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers. So we're going to have a break in just a minute. I'm just going to really quickly, So I'm going to really quickly share something that we've been working on at GDS. So kind of, to be honest, quite inspired by these posters of kind of bringing to life different conditions and providing guidance with, last week or the week before, last month, we published a set of 7 user profiles, which are text-based kind of articles that bring to life some conditions and some barriers that people face, and then provide tips and techniques for how to overcome them. And we also link to, so say for example, we have Ashley, who's a partially sighted screen reader user. You can kind of read about some of the challenges that she faces when using websites. We kind of list some of the common things that screen reader users, some of the barriers that they face, and we then, for example, we point to various resources out there that will help you to avoid those barriers. So a really common issue that screen reader users face is forms not being marked up correctly. So a screen reader user gets to a page that has a form. They know that there's a form there, but due to the markup being bad, the label for that form is not read out. So they don't know what to put in that form item. So we actually then point to some examples of some forms that have the right markup. Some of this is kind of GDS things, some is kind of out there on the web. So this feels like another technique to raise awareness and to kind of get people designing and building in the right way. And there's probably lots of other ways, like you say, a checklist. There's kind of not one best way to do this, but if people are kind of looking and reading different things, hopefully we can kind of help people on that journey of making things more accessible. So we have Ashley, who's a screen reader user. We've got Christopher, who's got arthritis. We've got Claudia, who's a screen magnifier user. We've got Paul, who's on the autistic spectrum. We've got Ron, who's an older user with multiple conditions. We've got Salim, who's profoundly deaf, and Simone, who's a dyslexic user. So yeah, this is just a similar way to kind of bring to life some of that. And these link back to the posters and kind of, get people, if they've started here, to then kind of move on and see the posters as well, because the more of this sort of information that we can get out there, the better. So awesome. So we're going to have a break now. If I can have a round of applause for our speakers so far.